So we talked about the cells. Now let's talk about very, very important concept, which is the synapse and how the nerve impulse travels between different neurons. Usually, we have series of neurons or nerve cells to execute an action. Like, let's say the motor center decided that your arm should move. So the motor center has nerve cell, and out of this nerve cell comes a nerve fiber. You think it's gonna be only one very long nerve fiber that goes all the way from your motor cortex all the way down to your biceps to flex your left elbow? No, it takes more than one neuron. So this first, we call it the first order neuron. And then there is a second one, we call it second order neuron. And most of the time there is a third order neuron and maybe even a fourth and fifth order neuron, until finally it reaches the nerve fiber that is going to your biceps or that is going to the gland or whatever the organ that will execute the function. Now, how does the impulse travel? It travels electrically as a wave of depolarization down the axon. But between the different neurons, this is the first order neuron, and this is the second order neuron, you notice that there is no physical continuity. There is no physical continuity. There is a gap, and this gap is known as synapse. This gap is known as the synapse. So this is the synapse. See this gap here? This is the synapse. So this part is called the presynaptic part. This part is like this part here. So this vesicles here, this is the presynaptic between the second and third neuron. And this, the receptors here on the dendrites, the receptors here are called postsynaptic. And the gap in between is the synapse. So how does the impulse travels across the synapse? It travels chemically. So the presynaptic nerve fiber releases chemicals, and these chemicals are responsible for transmitting the nerve impulse from one neuron to the next. And therefore, we call these chemicals, we call them neurotransmitters. So the action potential, which travels down the axon as a wave of depolarization, it travels across the synapses, across the gaps between the neurons as chemical messengers or as neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters are responsible for the chemical conduction of the nerve impulse. And let me use again the whiteboard to explain very important concept about neurotransmitters. Let's say that's the first order neuron, and that's the second order neuron. So that's the first order, and that's the second order neuron. Now, the neurotransmitters get out of this. So the neurotransmitters here, let me draw them as this blue dots. So these are the neurotransmitters coming out of the first order neuron. That's the first order neuron. So they will be received by receptors here on the second order neuron. So the second order neuron has receptors that will receive these chemicals. And the interaction between these blue dots and the receptors can result in one of two things. So one of two scenarios can happen now. One of two scenarios can happen now. Either the interaction between the blue dots and the receptors results in positive charges going inside the neuron, and then what is going to happen to this second neuron when positive charges go inside? Is it going to be awake or asleep? Positive charges, is it going to activate the neuron or put the neuron to sleep?
Activate.
Activate. So we call this scenario, and we call the neurotransmitter in this case, we call it excitatory neurotransmitter. Excitatory neurotransmitter. Why? Because the release of this neurotransmitter led to activation of the second neuron, activation of the following neuron. The release of this neurotransmitter, or the interaction between this neurotransmitter and the postsynaptic neuron, caused activation of the next neuron. This scenario is excitatory scenario. But sometimes, as a result of the interaction between the neurotransmitter and the receptors on the second neuron, as a result of this, you get more negativity inside the second neuron. So the second neuron will be put to sleep. In this case, we consider this scenario inhibitory scenario, and we consider the neurotransmitter in this case is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. So how we call the neurotransmitter, how we describe the neurotransmitter, excitatory or inhibitory, is not about the final response that you get. It's about the response of the next neuron, the response of the next neuron. If the next neuron gets excited because of the release of this neurotransmitter, that's an excitatory scenario. If the next neuron gets inhibited because of the release of this neurotransmitter, that's an inhibitory scenario, and this neurotransmitter here is described as inhibitory neurotransmitter. And this explains why some of the neurotransmitters, like dopamine is one of the very famous neurotransmitters in the brain. In some parts of the brain, dopamine plays the role of an excitatory neurotransmitter. As in schizophrenia, in the mesolimbic system and mesocortical system, dopamine is excitatory. It leads to excitation of the next neuron. And because of this, you get the positive symptoms of schizophrenia, like the aggression and hallucinations. All the positive symptoms of schizophrenia result from the excitatory effect of dopamine in the mesolimbic system. Whereas dopamine in the basal ganglia plays an inhibitory role. When you release dopamine in the basal ganglia, it inhibits the next series of neurons and prevents the next series of neurons from doing their job and from becoming activated. So dopamine in some parts of the brain is excitatory, and in some parts is inhibitory. It depends on what? It depends on the type of receptor present on the postsynaptic. So it depends on the postsynaptic neuron. It depends on the type of postsynaptic receptor. And that's why we have different types of dopamine receptors. We have dopamine 1, 2, and dopamine 3 receptors. Serotonin, or 5-HT, that's the shorthand for serotonin. Serotonin is another very important neurotransmitter in the brain, and we have different types of serotonin receptors, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so the different receptors respond to the same neurotransmitter in different ways. Okay, and not all areas of the brain have the same type of receptor. Different areas of the brain have different types of receptors, and that's why the effect or the action of one neurotransmitter differ from one area to another in the brain depending on the type of the receptor. But we still have some neurotransmitters that are always inhibitory. Always inhibitory. Wherever they exist in the brain, they lead to what? They inhibit the next neuron. They inhibit the next neuron. They keep the next neuron polarized. They keep the next neuron negatively charged. An example of an always inhibitory neurotransmitter, GABA, gamma amino butyric acid. GABA is like the off switch of the brain. GABA is the off switch of the brain. If you wanna inhibit any neuron, release GABA, and this neuron will be inhibited. This neuron will be prevented from work. This neuron will be asleep. And some neurotransmitters are always excitatory wherever they are released in the brain. An example of an excitatory neurotransmitter is glutamate. Glutamate, when it interacts with the NMDA receptors, it always excites the postsynaptic neuron. It always activates the next neuron. And therefore, glutamate is described as the on switch of the brain. Glutamate is the on switch of the brain. So different neurotransmitters play different roles depending on the type of receptor they interact with. The concept of neurotransmitters is very important, not just in pathophysiology, but also in pharmacology. And understanding this concept is the basics for understanding many neurologic and psychologic disorders. Acetylcholine can be excitatory or inhibitory. Norepinephrine can be excitatory or inhibitory. Serotonin, generally inhibitory. Dopamine can be excitatory, as in mesolimbic system, inhibitory, as in basal ganglia. Gamma aminobutyric acid, GABA, always inhibitory. Glutamate, always excitatory. We have endorphins, enkephalins, generally inhibitory. We have substance P, generally excitatory. And serotonin is related to mood, together with norepinephrine. So deficiency of serotonin and norepinephrine in the brain can lead to, or this is one of the theories, this is the most accepted theory to explain major depressive disorders. Deficiency or low activity of serotonin and norepinephrine in the brain causes this depressed mood. Deficiency of dopamine in the basal ganglia messes up with the function of the basal ganglia, leading to Parkinson. This is the pathophysiology of Parkinson, and we will discuss it in the next segment. Gamma aminobutyric acid, inhibitory. We make use of this fact in pharmacology. When someone is anxious and you want to sedate them, we give them benzodiazepines. What do? Benzodiazepines stimulate the GABA neurons. So when they stimulate the GABA neurons, a lot of GABA is released from these neurons, and this will calm down the patient, okay? Because they inhibit the next neurons. So any sedative can work through GABA. Many of the anticonvulsants, what's the problem in convulsions? Unexplained activity of the neurons. Some of the neurons at one spot of the brain are active for no reason. So if you want to inhibit them, give them gabapentin. pregabalin, some drugs that release GABA, and this GABA will put these neurons to sleep, will inhibit them. So this is the concept of neurotransmitters that we play with in pharmacology. Acetylcholine is also important for memory. It's important for cognitive functions. And if you lose acetylcholine, you lose your cognitive functions, and this is the major pathophysiologic problem in Alzheimer's. We get deficiency of acetylcholine content in the limbic system, and this causes decline in the cognitive functions. Dopamine is the pleasure hormone. So dopamine is released whenever you do any action that brings pleasure. If, like, when you drive fast, this makes you feel good. So actually, when you drive fast, a lot of dopamine come out in your brain, and it makes you feel good. So next time you drive, you want to drive even faster than the last time to get more dopamine and to get more pleasure, and so on. So problems with dopamine can be associated with addiction. Serotonin and norepinephrine, as I talked before, associated with mood. So deficiency of these neurotransmitters in the brain can explain major depressive disorders. That's why we treat depression by SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And reuptake means what? The neurotransmitter, once it's released from the presynaptic neuron, and it interacts with the receptor, it is reuptaken back to the first neuron. So if you inhibit this reuptake by SSRIs, if you inhibit the serotonin reuptake by giving the serotonin reuptake inhibitors, this means you keep the neurotransmitter available in the synapses, so you increase the chances of interaction between the neurotransmitter and the postsynaptic receptors, so you increase the opportunities of getting the response to this neurotransmitter. So playing with these neurotransmitters is the basics for psych pharmacology. GABA is always inhibitory. And I will end this segment here, and starting from the coming segments, we're going to talk about some neurological disorders that we did not mention in the first part of the lecture. So